Okay, today's going to be one of the most miserable days of your life because you're going to put double spiral locks in a piston, which these make no sense when the true arcs, the regular old circlips we used to use in street Hemis, they never came out of a street Hemi. But they've decided now that we all have 11,000 RPM Pro stock motors and we need double spiral locks. Now you're not going to be able to see anything because my hands are going to be in the way, but we're going to go through the motions anyway. So you're not supposed to spread this thing out like an accordion, you know. You're supposed to be a little more gentle. When you get done, your fingers are all going to be chewed up and look like you've been in a cat fight. Okay, so I try to take this and hook that in there. By the way, as you know, I'm not the best at this. I'm just a guy trying to put a spiral lock in, and it's not easy. It's a miserable, terrible thing. Then I just try to work it in. It's supposed to be a little more receptive to my actions here. And when this screwdriver slips, it hurts, by the way. Yeah, this one's, that's okay. We're getting there. Yeah, we're getting there. And so that is what putting a spiral lock in is. It's going to hurt. You're liable to have some blood marks, but we're good. Now it's time to put the pistons and the rods together so we can get the short block assembled. There's several things you can check on the piston. The clearance in between the ring and the piston on these was 1.5 thou, and they were right on the money like they should be. The rods, of course, this side goes to the chamfer of the crankshaft. You see how that's got that chamfer there, and this side goes to the other rod, but all that's invisible to you. All you need to know is the tangs go to the outside of the block. So when you put this together, the intake will be going to the inside, the exhaust will be going to the outside, so the tang goes to the exhaust. Don't screw that up or you won't like it, because you'll have to take this back apart, and when you got double spiral locks, that's no fun. You need to mark the rods. In the old days we used to stamp these, but these new rods, you know, you hone these to 1/10 of a thousandths, and people don't want to be hammering on something honed to that tight. Not to mention these new rods, they really don't have a flat spot here for you to stamp them. So you'll get one of these scribes and scribe on there. You need to practice. If you haven't used one of these before, you just get a piece of scrap steel and practice for a second. Make sure that it's still going to look bad when you write that on there. It just doesn't look as good as the old stamp days, but that's just the way it is nowadays. So practice that up and be careful when you're putting this to the piston. Tang goes to the outside of the block, tang goes to the exhaust side, and of course you're going to have to lube all this up real good when you assemble this. You know, you're not going to have another chance, so make sure you've got that lubed up good. But onto the piston. There's lots of instructions that have to do with the pistons. This particular piston uses a pin that goes behind the oil ring, and when you do that, you've got this bridge here, so you'll use this oil support rail. There is a dimple on this oil support rail. This will go on first. This will be after you get the rod attached, this will go on first. This dimple keeps the support rail from moving too far. So it goes down. The dimple goes down, and you put it right in here, and that keeps it from turning. So don't put this on there with the dimple over here. That's going to jam everything up. There's no room there for it to work with. So make sure you get the dimple. This goes on first, but the dimple right in the, and before you put the piston in the cylinder, check and make sure, you know, when we oil up this piston, we're going to be doing this, trying to get everything to move around a little bit and get that oil back there. So before you stick it in the hole, make sure you got the dimple down and right there. And then you will put your oil ring on next, the expander first, and then these two. And then you'll go to the second ring. Now the second and the top ring, 99% of the time I guess, have a top and a bottom. And there are several things in the directions that tell you. But most everything is going to have either a dimple, that means that side up, or it's got writing on it. That means that side up. And you'll have, and they'll be in a package that tells you which one is the second groove and which one is the top groove. They've got those fancy pliers that you can spread these with when you're installing them, and I think I've broke more with the spreader tool than I have by just wrapping them on. But you don't want to break if you break a ring, one ring plus UPS is going to be $50 and 7 weeks, or I mean a week from Phoenix before you get it. So it's not going to be a pleasant experience if you break a ring. Okay, let's put some rings on the piston. The first thing that goes on is the oil rail support. Find the dimple, put it over the right there, so the dimple stops when it hits that. It's easier to put it in the right place rather than try to move it later. It fits kind of tight. Just start it and then wrap it around. I never said I was the best at doing this, by the way, you know. I'm no better at rings than anybody else. Okay, and the dimple is right where we want, in between here. Now you scoot this thing down so we can put the oil ring in. Now there is a map that comes with your rings. So I just, like I'm sitting in the car, engine to the front, and read the map that way, and that tells you where to put the top rail gaps and all of that. Okay, next is the oil expander. It says this is the front of the engine, and this goes under the intake valve. Intake valve being to the middle of the motor, and we've got the map laying out where the front's that way. Okay, then we get one of the rails. The bottom oil rail gap goes right here. So we just stick that in there and wrap it around. that looks like it fits. Our top goes over here. By the way, these pistons that have the pin behind the oil rail, you know, they have to do that sometimes because your rod is long, or if you're running heavy nitrous, they move the ring stack down on the piston. And if you have to put up with it, that's fine. But if you can have it either way, you want this below the oil ring just because it makes it easier for you. All right, we're on the second groove ring. And we'll look at this and make sure it feels good. Oh, looks good to me. The lettering on the top, so we're going the right place. The second one's the hardest because it's further down and it's made out of cast iron usually, I think, and then you're worried you're going to break it. And I got mad at my pliers after I broke a ring using it one time, so you know how it is. I didn't get this in the group good. So you just stretch that baby around there. Try to get it in the groove so it's makes it easier for the final to go in. Just walk it on in there. And we're good. You don't have to worry about positioning this because later on we're going to be doing this when we put the oil on there, and so we won't set that till the last minute. Top ring, and it's got the letters right there, so we're legit. Be a nice little ring and go on there. Yeah. And that's all there is to it. Now we oil up our pistons and get them ready to put in. Of course, there's not much to do in this, not much to show you, but there is a couple of things to go over. The rings, you want to make sure they're not sticking out away from the piston. They want to have them back 5/1000ths in the land, and so I can catch my fingernail on that. So we're legit. That's just something you check. You know, mistakes can be made, and that not be deep enough, but we're okay. Everything's good there. Between oiling the rings, and then you want the half oil, half STP mix on the bearing, and then ARP lube on the rod bolts. I guess the most important part about this is the Walmart baby wipes, because that's what you're really going to be using the most. I mean, this stuff is so nasty all over your hands at once, it's terrible. But I don't do anything special here. I try to line this up where my gaps are right there, just to get some oil down in there. And then you just work it back and forth and round, and then move the gap over here and get a little in. And I keep doing this longer than I'll show you on camera, but you know what I'm trying to do here. I'm just working them in and out, and I just want some lube in there, you know. And then I end up doing the same thing on the oil ring. I do it a little separately, but I know I'm making a mess, but that's just the way I do it. And then, of course, when you get done with all this, you'll want to smear some on the skirts, smear some on the sides, And then of course lube up the bearing before you stick it in. And then I think we've covered everything to shoving the pistons in there. On the number 1, 2, 7, and 8, you'll have interference. If you're 4 or 500 bore, if you're 4.5 inch bore, you're going to have to notch your ring compressor there. You want to set your crank throw where it's sticking down pretty good, where you can get to the rod nuts, bolts, when you get it pushed all the way down. If you've got a piston already in the other side, you want to move that rod over so you'll give it some room. But on these 4 holes, you can't just put the ring compressor on the piston, because then it's going to be too hard to get it square in there. So you need to put that in here, and you can take it off and then wiggle it on down if you want. But you know what I'm trying to say. You can't just put it in there, because then the notch won't line up. Now once you get this in here, you can take it out and wiggle it around and get it like you want it. But to line it up first, you have to do that in the cylinder because of this notch. If you try to do that, it doesn't work out well without the notch. The piston won't go in the hole. It gets kind of depressing. Okay, once you get it lined up and you know that it's straight like you want it, then you can pull it out and wiggle it around like you would normally do to get everything ready to knock the piston in. Now that we've got everything square with the world, we can knock it in. Now you want to be guiding it in with your fingers down here on the bottom so you don't run the rod into the crank. You can feel it good there. Now you roll it over and put the cap on. I don't know if we discussed this when we were talking about the rods, but on these new style rods where you have the centering dowels here, you know, the cap won't go down but about that far, and on these Calis it was probably twice that tall. So once you get them finger tight when you're putting them in, you can't just run these down like on one side, because you know these locating dowels are trying to center the cap just right. So once you get them tight, you'll just want to turn about a quarter turn at a time to walk it down there evenly. And then once you get that tight, to torque them, I checked the side clearance and it had a 23, which is more than the OEM spec, but all the aftermarket rods are like that, so you can live with it. But this is 20 thousandths aluminum, and I feel that when you're trying to, these rod bolts, these are only 75. These are only 1.6 long, 75 foot-pounds. But some of those ARPs are 105 foot-pounds. And that just seems like a lot to be twisting on that rod. I don't know, it just doesn't sound good to me. So I stick that in there, and that way when you're torquing it, I feel better. You can still get the torque wrench past this and it'll work fine. You'd probably want to do these in 2 steps, like 40 first time and then 75. And you don't have to hit it right on the number like that. You can, you know what I mean, just walk it down, but make sure you got a smooth pull when you're coming up on 75. So I'll torque all of these down, and then the short block will be done.